By Ted Cantle, who headed a government task force on the race riots in Oldham in 2001, Humera, who was on one of the working groups of the British Muslims set up by the government after the attacks on London in July, and by Darcus, Howe, who's written extensively on all these issues. Ted Cantle, first of all, are we really moving in the direction of America, do you think?
Well, I think there's no doubt that segregation is increasing. Certainly when I did my review of the Bradford, Oldham and Burnley race riots, there was no doubt that the concept of parallel lives, communities living completely separate lives, was evident. And since then, I think segregation probably has, if anything, moved on and got a little worse. I think Trevor's used somewhat emotive language, but nevertheless, he's right to draw attention to the growing segregation. And we have to tackle that now.
Darcus, do you buy that? I mean, we're sleepwalking into the nightmare of fully fledged ghettos.
And the only person who is not sleepwalking is Trevor. I say something quite plainly, that in America, segregation was imposed by law, established by the Ku Klux Klan. After that, hundreds of thousands of people died in the process of liberation from segregation and slavery, etc. Britain is quite a different kettle of fish. We've been here 50 years. We lived near to where we worked. We couldn't afford independent housing outside of the council. So there was a joke. There was a fire, Pakistanis living here, West Indians living there, and for 2 days, West Indians and Pakistanis were running out. And we were poor, we worked, and we built communities to sustain ourselves as workers.
Humera, I mean, if it's done by choice in that sense, as Darcus is making a distinction with the United States, we were never segregated. No one was ever told you have to live in this area of Leicester or that area of Birmingham. Does it matter?
I don't think it was done fully by choice, in the sense that, particularly if you're migrant communities, you go to where the cheap housing is often, or where already pockets of your communities already exist. I think I just don't agree with Ted's analysis of it, that therefore by definition that is a bad thing. The fact that if people are not getting equal access to education, to employment, to services, that's another issue. But people living together in predominantly one community is not by definition a bad thing.
Ted, I mean, you could say there are many white people who would say we don't get equal access actually because we're quite poor too and we would like better services in our area. It's not a race question, is it? It's a money question, it's a poverty question.
Well, I think we have to pursue equal opportunities for whichever group is affected. But there is a problem with living in entirely separate and segregated communities, because having no contact between different communities means that the fear and ignorance spreads, and it is then possible for groups like the extreme right to demonise one community over another. And we've seen that they've done that successfully. They've capitalised on that fear and ignorance and led directly to some of the violence that we've seen only a few years ago.
What would you do about it? I mean, you wouldn't do what they tried in America, which was pretty disastrous, which was busing school children from one school to another. I mean, how would you socially engineer people's choices?
Well, I think firstly we have to actually make sure that the choice is a level playing field. I think a lot of communities are afraid to move out of their areas. They are in a position where other areas do not have the support networks that they need, so we have to put that right. Secondly, we have to make sure that in all segregated areas there is equal access to the different facilities that are there, and that means building up trust across communities. For example, in segregated schools, you start by twinning different schools together, developing sports programs and arts programs, getting children meeting often for the first time and getting the teachers meeting often for the first time, so that you can build up the trust on which you build and then build mixed intakes into those schools.
Darcus.
In Britain, it's too small to segregate anybody. When Ted thinks there is a segregation, you find Asians like Beckham. You find Westerners like Flintoff. So the impact on each other is not that wide. I want to ask Ted, how come you suddenly believe that this difference in color, that's all it is, color of skin, becomes a catastrophe, so that if you're in Glasgow and Roman Catholic is segregated from the other Protestants. Why don't you call that segregation?
But
it only
isn't
comes...
isn't it a disaster if people in Britain don't know somebody of another colour or another race or another religion? Isn't that
Let me tell
bad
you something.
or not?
You know what I found disastrous? The fact that West Indians and Asians were separated from each other. Because my best friend is a Parsi from India. Ted and they say it's white people, not between West Indian and Asians who worked in the same factories. He's saying it's white people. And it's therefore, there's this subliminal racial thing that they have that tells us that we have to join them because for some reason we are ill-equipped to negotiate an industrial society. I don't believe that for a moment. Listen, I could negotiate this society as good as Ted and sometimes better.
Right, but Humera, I mean, the reason we're all very worried about this, obviously you were on the task force, is because there's a very small minority of people who do crazy things. And I mean, how do you get to them?
Well, I don't think you get through to them by task force, basically, necessarily, because I think...
you wasted your time.
Well, that's debatable. I think I went out of interest, really, and I think that...
Your own interest?
Out of my own interest.
Okay, my dear.
Just curiosity, really. I think that I grew up in Brent, which is thoroughly multicultural, almost segregated, you can argue, a school, predominantly non-white school. We didn't have those kind of problems. People got on with each other. We overcame those barriers. But what seems to break down is when you actually institutionally something breaks down. And what really troubles me about the government initiatives, about Cantle and his approach, is that the community itself is still being blamed for its failure to integrate.
Is it, or is it just a few people within the community? I mean, people are sophisticated enough not to blame all Muslims for this. Nobody does that, do they?
I think what really affected me greatly following the 7/7 bombings is that while there were those people who directly harassed and attacked Muslims in the streets, there was equally phenomenally, I would argue, even more Londoners who were supportive and smiling and giving through body language really a sort of affirmation of appreciation and respect for each other that way. And I think that there's some things that is beyond the remit of policy and government initiatives, that human beings do operate at one level on that scale.
Right, Ted Cantle, you want to come back on that point?
Well, look, we've made a mistake with our multicultural model, unfortunately, which is a good model in many respects, but what we've actually done is continue to emphasise the differences between people, and we've forgotten that we've actually got to build commonalities as well. So a lot of the funding, a lot of the institutional arrangements goes in to recognising and perpetuating differences rather than building commonalities between communities. And this is not a simple white versus black issue. Look at the divisions within the BME communities, which Darcus himself has drawn attention to. A lot of different tensions which have been developing, and we have to recognise that this is not a simple matter, it's a complex issue which can't just be dealt with in the old model.
Gavin, what I say? Similarities are boring. Differences are creative.
So we don't emphasise differences, but we celebrate differences.
I'd like to find out what is different between my Pakistani and I. In the green room, I'm talking to her about differences. Differences do not contribute to separation. They contribute to interest, they contribute to struggling, they contribute to resolution.
Just a brief...
One thing I want to say, the only time that they become different is if you want an Anglo-Saxon culture to dominate
very briefly,
the world.
Humera, on that.
I think where that breaks down is that the discussion has only ever been superficial, whether you call it multiculturalism, anti-racism or community cohesion. It's only superficial policy. We've got to get to the human level.
OK, thanks very much. Coming up on the programme.